Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a tree. Not just any tree, but a living cathedral rising 200 feet into the mist-shrouded sky of the Pacific Northwest. Its trunk wider than a small room. Its roots drinking from earth that has known 10,000 winters. Its branches sheltering eagles, bears, and the whispered prayers of countless generations. Now imagine approaching this tree not with a saw, not with machinery, not with the cold efficiency of industry, but with ceremony, with songs passed down through 40 generations, with an understanding so profound that you don't simply take from the tree, you enter into relationship with it. This is where most of us get the story of Native American woodworking completely wrong. We've been taught to think of ancient craftsmanship as primitive, simple tools creating simple objects out of necessity. We imagine survival, not artistry, function, not philosophy. We see museum exhibits of carved masks and towering totem poles, and we marvel at the skill, yes, but we miss the deeper truth hiding in plain sight. These weren't just craftsmen, they were priests of the forest, translators between worlds, guardians of a relationship between human and tree that most modern people can barely comprehend. The Haida people of the Pacific Northwest coast, specifically the archipelago known today as Haida Gwaii or Islands of the People, developed over thousands of years what might be the most sophisticated wood culture on Earth. But sophistication doesn't mean what we think it means. It's not about having more tools or faster techniques. It's about having deeper knowledge, more complete understanding. A relationship with cedar so intimate that the line between material and spirit becomes impossible to draw. Here's what I find most haunting about this story. There are Haida master carvers alive today who can look at a fallen log and tell you not just what it could become, but what it wants to become. They can read the grain like a book, see the face hidden in the wood, understand the spirit waiting to emerge. This isn't poetry, though it sounds like it. This is practical knowledge earned through lifetimes of attention so focused it becomes a form of communion. But this knowledge nearly died. In the span of just a few generations, diseases brought by European contact decimated the Haida population by over 90%. Entire villages vanished. Potlatch ceremonies, the cultural heartbeat where carving knowledge was displayed and transferred, were banned by colonial governments. The great red cedars were logged by the millions, shipped away to become shingles and siding and telephone poles, their spirits unacknowledged, their gifts unreturned. And yet, against every historical odd, the tradition survived. Over the next 90 minutes, we're going to journey into one of humanity's most beautiful relationships with the natural world. We're going to understand not just how the Haida carved cedar, but why, and what that why reveals about ways of knowing that Western science is only beginning to recognize. This isn't a story about the past. It's a story about memory, continuity, and the kind of wisdom that refuses to die, even when nearly everyone who carries it does. Let's begin where all Haida stories begin, in the forest, standing before a tree, learning to listen. Before we step into the ancient groves and the carving houses, before we witness the transformation of cedar into canoe and mask and monument, I want to tell you what this journey is really about. This is not a romantic tale of simpler times or people living in harmony with nature. The Haida relationship with cedar was complex, sophisticated, demanding, and far more challenging than anything most modern people attempt with the natural world. It required knowledge that took lifetimes to acquire, and attention spans that make our digital age look like collective attention deficit disorder. What you're about to discover is a complete system of knowledge, ecological, spiritual, practical, and artistic, that treated a tree as a partner in creation rather than a resource to be extracted. Here's the promise I'm making to you. By the end of this story, you will understand 3 profound truths that have been largely forgotten in modern life. First, you will understand the difference between taking and receiving. The Haida didn't take cedar, they received it. Through elaborate protocols of request, gratitude, and reciprocity, that turned every act of harvesting into a ceremony of relationship. This distinction might sound subtle, but it changes everything. It's the difference between a world of infinite resources waiting to be exploited and a world of living beings offering gifts that must be honored. Second, you will see how traditional knowledge represents not a primitive stage in human development, but a different kind of sophistication entirely. One based on depth rather than breadth, on relationship rather than control, on listening rather than commanding. The Haida master carver spent 50 years learning to read cedar. The modern logger spends 50 hours learning to fell trees. Both are skilled, but the knowledge isn't remotely comparable. Third, and this is perhaps most important, you will witness how cultural continuity works, how knowledge survives catastrophe, how traditions adapt without abandoning their core, and why this matters desperately for all of us living through our own era of disruption and loss. The story of Haida carving is ultimately about memory, not the passive memory of museums and textbooks, but active memory, memory that lives in hands and hearts, memory that transforms with each generation while remaining fundamentally true to its source, memory that refuses to become mere nostalgia. But here's what makes this story especially powerful right now, at this moment in human history. We are living through an extinction event of traditional knowledge systems. Indigenous languages, each one a unique way of understanding reality, disappear every few weeks. Craft traditions that took millennia to develop vanish in a single generation. Relationships with local ecosystems, refined over thousands of years, are forgotten in favor of industrial agriculture and global supply chains. The Haida carving tradition survived near total cultural genocide. It survived because enough people believed that some knowledge is worth dying for, and therefore worth living for with absolute commitment. What I want you to consider as we move through this story is this: what knowledge in your own life is worth that level of commitment? What relationships, with place, with craft, with tradition, with the living world, are you willing to tend across years and decades with the patience of a master carver approaching a cedar log? Because here's the hidden truth in this ancient story. The Haida didn't just carve cedar. They carved themselves, generation by generation, into people capable of seeing and honoring the living world with an attention that transformed seeing into relationship and relationship into art. We're about to explore how they did it and what we've lost by forgetting. Let's journey now to the islands at the edge of the world, where the forest meets the sea and cedar grows tall enough to touch the clouds. Haida Gwaii sits off the northern coast of British Columbia, like a question mark pointing toward Alaska. An archipelago of over 150 islands, separated from the mainland by the turbulent waters of Hecate Strait. The islands are sometimes called the Galapagos of the North because of their unique ecosystems. Species evolved here that exist nowhere else on Earth. But long before scientists arrived with their classification systems, the Haida knew these islands as the only world that mattered. They called themselves Haida, simply the people, because in their worldview, they were the people, the ones who belonged to these specific rocks and trees and waters. Picture the landscape. Massive Sitka spruce and red cedar growing so dense that even at noon, the forest floor remains in twilight. Western hemlock and yellow cedar filling the understory. Berry bushes heavy with fruit in late summer. Salmonberry, huckleberry, thimbleberry. Rivers thick with salmon during the autumn runs. So many fish that the streams seem to boil with silver bodies. The coastline, and remember, on an island everything is coastline, is a maze of rocky inlets, hidden coves, tide pools teeming with life. Harbor seals sun themselves on exposed rocks. Sea lions bark from offshore reefs. In spring and fall, gray whales pass so close to shore you can hear their breathing, that explosive whoosh as they surface. And rising above it all, towering in the river valleys and climbing the mountainsides, are the cedars. Western red cedar, Thuja plicata in Latin, but that name captures nothing of what the tree means. The Haida called it various names depending on context, but understood it as the foundation of their entire material culture. Imagine a cedar 500 years old. Its trunk 20 feet in diameter at the base, tapering gradually to a height that makes you dizzy trying to see the top. The bark hangs in long, fibrous strips, perfect for weaving when processed. The wood itself is straight-grained, resistant to rot, light enough to float, strong enough to cross oceans. But here's what most people don't realize about these trees. They were understood by the Haida not as timber, not as resources, but as elder relatives. The cedars had been there long before any living human. They would be there long after. They witnessed the lives of countless generations. They held the memories of the land itself. The Haida worldview doesn't make a sharp distinction between human people and tree people, between animal people and stone people. All are persons, different kinds of persons with different gifts and responsibilities, but persons nonetheless, deserving of respect and relationship. This isn't animism in the sense of primitive superstition. It's a sophisticated ecological philosophy that recognizes cedar as a living being with its own intelligence, its own form of awareness, its own place in the web of relationships that constitute the world. The climate of Haida Gwaii shaped everything about life here. Mild, wet, dominated by the ocean. Winters rarely see snow at sea level. Instead, weeks of steady rain that nourish the forest and fill the rivers. Summers are cool, foggy, the islands wrapped in mist that rolls in from the Pacific. This is a rainforest, a temperate rainforest that receives over 100 inches of rain per year in some locations. Everything grows, everything rots, everything feeds something else in an endless cycle of growth and decay. The soil is thin but incredibly rich, built up over millennia from fallen trees and salmon carcasses, and the droppings of 10,000 generations of eagles and ravens and bears. In this landscape of abundance, the Haida developed a culture of unparalleled artistic sophistication. They had time, because the land provided generously, to devote to ceremony, to artistry, to the slow development of skills that transformed utilitarian objects into works of spiritual power, and at the center of it all was cedar. To understand Haida carving, you must first understand Haida society, because the two are inseparable. The social structure provided the framework within which carving traditions were transmitted, refined, and given meaning. The Haida were organized into two main moieties, exogamous groups called eagle and raven. Every person belonged to one or the other through matrilineal descent. You inherited your mother's moiety, and you had to marry someone from the opposite moiety. This created a fundamental duality in Haida culture, a balance of opposites that needed each other to function. Within each moiety were multiple clans, and within each clan were family lineages, each with its own history, crest animals, traditional stories, and owned territories. This wasn't ownership in the Western property sense, more like stewardship, responsibility, belonging. Your lineage didn't own a salmon stream. It belonged to that stream, and had the responsibility to care for it and harvest from it sustainably. Social status in Haida culture was complex and multi-layered. There were nobles, commoners, and slaves, usually captives from raids on other groups. But status wasn't static. It could be gained or lost based on one's actions, generosity, and ability to uphold family honor. And here's where carving becomes central. Status was displayed and validated through the potlatch ceremony. The potlatch, from a Chinook word meaning to give, was the beating heart of Northwest Coast culture. These were massive feasts lasting days or weeks, where a host would invite hundreds of guests, feed them lavishly, and give away or even destroy enormous amounts of wealth to demonstrate their power and generosity. But potlatches weren't just about showing off. They were how knowledge was transferred, how rights and privileges were validated, how stories were told and retold, how the social fabric was woven and repaired. And the artistic productions displayed at potlatches, carved poles, masks, regalia, canoes, were the visible proof of a lineage's connection to the spirit world and their ancestors. A master carver in traditional Haida society held extraordinary status. They were not just craftsmen. They were essentially shamanic figures who could transform cedar into vessels for supernatural power. The greatest carvers knew hundreds of designs passed down through their lineages. They understood not just how to carve a face, but how to carve that particular spirit, that specific ancestor, in a way that would make the mask or pole come alive during ceremonies. Carvers typically learned their art through apprenticeship, beginning in childhood by watching, then assisting, then gradually taking on more complex tasks under the scrutiny of master carvers. This could take decades. The finest carvers might not produce their masterworks until they were in their 50s or 60s, when their technical skill, knowledge of tradition, and spiritual understanding had all ripened fully. But here's something crucial to understand. Haida art was not art for art's sake. Every carved object had a purpose within the social and spiritual fabric of life. A totem pole wasn't decoration. It was a three-dimensional recounting of a family's history, their connection to supernatural beings, their rights and privileges. A ceremonial mask wasn't a sculpture. It was a vehicle for transformation, allowing a dancer to literally become the spirit represented. This means that the master carver carried tremendous responsibility. Errors weren't just aesthetic problems, they were spiritual and social catastrophes. To carve a being incorrectly, to place the wrong crest in the wrong position, to fail to properly honor the cedar's sacrifice, these were failures that could bring supernatural punishment or social shame. The society that supported master carvers was shattered by contact with Europeans. Beginning in the late 1700s, European and American trading ships arrived seeking sea otter pelts. They brought trade goods, yes, including metal tools that revolutionized carving, but they also brought smallpox, measles, influenza, tuberculosis. The population collapse was catastrophic. Conservative estimates suggest that over 90% of the Haida died between 1770 and 1900. Entire villages were abandoned. Whole lineages vanished, taking their stories and privileges and knowledge with them. By 1900, the Haida population had crashed from perhaps 30,000 to barely 2,000 people. The few survivors were forced by government policy to consolidate into two main villages, Skidegate and Old Masset. Potlatches were banned in 1884 by the Canadian government as part of a systematic attempt to destroy Indigenous cultures. Children were forcibly removed to residential schools where they were punished for speaking their language or practicing their traditions. And yet, the carving tradition survived. To the Haida, cedar was and is far more than a useful plant. Cedar is a being that chose to give itself to the people as a gift. This requires some explanation, because the Western mind tends to hear this as metaphor when the Haida mean it quite literally. In Haida oral tradition, there was a time before humans when the world was populated by supernatural beings who could take any form, human, animal, plant, or combinations thereof. These beings had adventures, made mistakes, learned lessons, and established the patterns that would govern the world after transformation. Cedar, in these stories, made a choice to become a tree that would provide for the people who were coming. The tree offered its bark for clothing and baskets, its wood for homes and canoes and carvings, its roots for weaving, even its boughs for medicine and ceremony. This wasn't slavery or exploitation. It was a covenant, a relationship based on mutual respect and reciprocity. The Haida understanding is that cedar gives these gifts willingly, but the gift must be received properly. This is crucial. The tree's consent must be sought. The reason for needing the tree must be valid. The harvest must be done in a way that honors the cedar's sacrifice, and something must be given in return. This is why, in traditional practice, you don't just walk into the forest and cut down a cedar. You wouldn't just walk into someone's home and take their possessions. The tree is a person, a different kind of person, yes, but a person nonetheless, deserving of the same respect you would give any elder. Modern Haida carvers who maintain traditional protocols describe the process of selecting a tree as a spiritual practice. You go into the forest with a specific purpose. You need a log for a totem pole, or a canoe, or house posts. You look for a tree that's appropriate, the right size, straight grain, healthy but perhaps already showing signs of age that suggest its life is moving toward completion. When you find a potential tree, you don't immediately start cutting. First, you address the tree. Different families have different traditions, but the essence is the same. You explain why you need the tree, what you intend to make, how it will be used. You ask permission. You might leave an offering, tobacco perhaps, or a gift of traditional food. Then you wait. You listen. You pay attention to signs, a sudden gust of wind, the cry of a raven, the feeling in your gut that tells you yes or no. Sometimes the answer is no, and you move on to another tree. Sometimes the answer is yes, and you proceed with the harvest. This might sound like superstition to modern ears, but consider what's actually happening here. You're forcing yourself to slow down, to pay attention, to treat the natural world as worthy of respect rather than simply available for exploitation. You're acknowledging that taking a 500-year-old tree is a serious act with consequences. You're building a relationship between yourself and the forest that will shape how you treat every tree from that point forward. The idea that Cedar wants to become something, a canoe, a mask, a housepost, isn't mystical nonsense. It's a sophisticated way of understanding that the physical properties of the wood, the patterns of the grain, the location of knots and imperfections, all suggest certain forms. A master carver learns to read these suggestions, to see what the tree is offering, rather than imposing arbitrary designs on unwilling material. This is the foundation of everything that follows. The technical skills of carving, the elaborate ceremonies, the transmission of knowledge across generations, all of it rests on this fundamental understanding that Cedar is a partner, not a resource, a gift giver, not a commodity. As we move into the heart of this story, the actual practices of harvesting, carving, and preserving this tradition, keep this relationship in mind. Because without it, you're just watching someone cut wood. With it, you're witnessing one of humanity's most beautiful experiments in living ethically with the natural world. Let's step now into the forest. It's early morning, and the mist hangs thick between the trees, softening every edge, muting every color to shades of green and gray. Your feet sink slightly into the spongy forest floor, centuries of needles and bark and fallen wood compressed into soft earth. You're walking with a Haida elder who has agreed to show you how cedar is traditionally harvested. He moves slowly, not from age, but from attention. Every few steps, he pauses, looks up into the canopy, touches the bark of a tree, listens to something you can't quite hear. This is already ceremony, though it doesn't look like what we usually call ceremony. There are no drums, no elaborate regalia, no obvious ritual, just careful attention. Just respect. The elder explains that his family has been harvesting from this grove for more generations than anyone can count. They know every tree. They know which ones were here when his great-grandfather was young, which ones fell in that winter storm 30 years ago, which ones are growing strong and which are showing signs of heart rot. This is not virgin wilderness in the modern imagination, untouched, pristine, empty of human influence. This is a working forest, a managed forest, but managed so carefully over so many generations that it looks wild to untrained eyes. The Haida have been tending these trees, harvesting sustainably, encouraging certain growth patterns for thousands of years. The elder stops before a massive cedar. Its base is wider than 3 people standing with arms outstretched. The bark is deeply furrowed, reddish-brown, with patches of moss growing in the crevices. The first branches start so high above that they disappear into the mist. "This one," he says quietly. "This one is ready." How does he know? He walks around the tree slowly, running his hand over the bark, looking up into its crown, studying the ground around its base. He's reading signs that mean nothing to you but speak volumes to him. The color of the bark, the pattern of branches, the way moss grows, the the condition of nearby trees. He's also listening in a way that has nothing to do with ears. This is the part that modern people struggle with, the idea that you can communicate with a tree, that you can sense whether it's willing to give itself. But watch someone who's done this for 50 years, and you'll see that it's not mysticism. It's deep observation, pattern recognition, ecological knowledge. And yes, something else. Call it intuition, call it spiritual sensitivity, call it whatever lets you sleep at night. But it's real. The elder takes something from his pocket, a small bundle wrapped in cedar bark. He unwraps it carefully, revealing tobacco, a traditional offering. He places it at the base of the tree and begins to speak. The language is Haida, Zad Keel, a language that was nearly lost, that fewer than 50 people speak fluently today, that sounds like water over stones, like wind through branches. You don't understand the words, but you understand the tone. Respectful, humble, grateful. He's explaining to the tree why he's here. He needs wood for his grandson, who is learning to carve. The boy needs a log to practice on, to make mistakes on, to gradually develop the skills that will one day make him a master carver. This is a worthy purpose. The tree's gift will be honored. The boy will be taught to respect what he's given. The elder explains that he will take the tree in the old way, not with chainsaws, though he's not opposed to modern tools entirely, but with careful handwork that minimizes damage to surrounding trees, that wastes nothing, that honors the completeness of the gift. Then he waits. He sits down on a fallen log nearby and simply waits, watching the tree, listening to the forest. Birds call overhead. A raven's croak, the distant hammer of a woodpecker. Wind moves through the upper branches, creating a sound like ocean waves. After perhaps 20 minutes, the elder stands. "We can proceed," he says. And you understand that something has shifted, some permission has been granted, though you couldn't say exactly what or how. Pause here and consider. What would change in your own life if you approached every significant act with this level of intentionality? Not just rushing forward because you want something or because you have the power to take it, but stopping, asking, listening for some deeper permission? The Haida protocol isn't about believing that trees have human-like consciousness. It's about building into your practice a moment of reflection, a check on impulse and greed, a reminder that your desires don't automatically justify your actions. It's about cultivating the kind of humility that prevents exploitation. We live in a culture of instant gratification, where desire and fulfillment collapse into the same moment. The Haida protocol inserts space, inserts consideration, inserts relationship. And in that space, something important happens. You remember that you're not alone in the world, not the only being whose needs matter, not entitled to take simply because you can. The actual felling of a tree is intensely physical labor, but it's also choreographed ceremony. Traditional Haida woodworkers used axes and wedges made of stone, then later of iron and steel obtained through trade. The techniques developed over millennia are remarkably sophisticated, allowing even massive trees to be brought down safely with minimal waste and minimal damage to surrounding forest. The elder begins by clearing the area around the tree's base, moving aside plants, checking overhead for widowmakers, dead branches that might fall, planning the direction of fall with exquisite care. In this dense forest, falling a giant tree without damaging its neighbors requires both skill and luck. He marks the tree with his axe, a small notch on the side he wants the tree to fall toward. Then he begins the undercut, a wedge-shaped notch about 1/3 of the way through the trunk. The sound of the axe striking wood rings through the forest, rhythmic, steady, almost meditative. Between swings, he speaks to the tree. Not constantly. He's not performing for an audience. Just occasional words, sometimes in Haida, sometimes in English. "Thank you, Uncle. We'll use you well. We'll honor your gift." The physical knowledge required here is extraordinary. He has to read the lean of the tree, account for wind, judge the weight distribution, understand how the wood will respond to stress. A mistake could kill him, could destroy the log, could damage trees that will need another century to replace. After the undercut is complete, clean, precise, creating a wedge-shaped opening, he moves to the opposite side of the tree and begins the back cut. This is cut slightly higher than the undercut, leaving a hinge of wood that will guide the tree's fall. The work is slow. Sweat darkens his shirt despite the cool air. Every few minutes, he stops, steps back, assesses. He taps wedges into the back cut, creating pressure that will push the tree toward its fall line. Then comes the moment. The tree creaks, a sound like the forest itself groaning. The sound grows louder, joined by the sharp crack of fibers snapping. The elder steps quickly away, moving behind another large tree for protection. The cedar begins to fall, slowly at first, almost gracefully, then accelerating. The top disappears into the mist, then reappears as the tree tilts past vertical. The sound is incredible, the rushing whoosh of displaced air, the crashing of branches through the canopy, and finally the tremendous impact as several hundred tons of wood slam into the earth. The ground shakes, birds explode from nearby trees, and then silence. A silence so complete it feels sacred, like the forest itself is holding its breath. The elder doesn't immediately rush to the fallen tree. He stands quietly for a moment, then walks slowly to where it lies. Its massive trunk now horizontal, its roots torn from the earth and pointing skyward in a tangle of dirt and wood. He places his hand on the trunk and speaks again. Words of thanks, of acknowledgement, of grief perhaps for the loss of this ancient being. Then he turns to the practical work of processing the log. But here's something most people don't know about traditional cedar harvest. The Haida didn't always fell the entire tree. For certain purposes, particularly bark stripping for weaving, they developed techniques to take what they needed while leaving the tree alive. Bark harvesting is its own elaborate practice. In late spring, when the sap is rising and the bark loosens from the wood, skilled harvesters would make vertical cuts in a living tree, then carefully peel away strips of bark. Done correctly, this doesn't kill the tree. The tree compartmentalizes the wound, continues growing, and will even produce new bark over time. You can still see these culturally modified trees, or CMTs, throughout Haida, ancient cedars with vertical scars where bark was removed decades or centuries ago. They're living monuments to a harvest practice that took only what was needed and allowed the tree to continue its life. For weaving cedar bark into clothing, baskets, and ceremonial regalia, the bark must be processed immediately. The outer bark is stripped away, and the inner bark, softer, more pliable, is worked while still fresh. Weavers would pull the strips through their hands repeatedly, softening the fibers, then hang them to dry before the final processing. Different parts of the cedar tree were used for different purposes, and knowing which part to harvest required extensive ecological knowledge. The bark at the base of the tree is thickest, best for structural elements. The bark higher up is thinner, better for fine weaving. The roots, excavated carefully from soft earth, are flexible and incredibly strong, perfect for lashing and basketry. The sapwood near the outside of the trunk is softer, easier to carve, but less durable. The heartwood deeper in the trunk is harder, more resistant to rot, better for objects that need to last generations. Knots and imperfections that would be defects in commercial lumber are opportunities in traditional carving. They create faces, suggest forms, add character. Once a tree is felled, the work of processing begins. The elder and his helpers, usually family members, usually younger people learning the practice, use wedges and wooden mallets to split sections from the log. Cedar splits beautifully along its grain, allowing massive logs to be broken down without sawing. They split off the sapwood first, useful for some purposes, but not what they need for this project. They're looking for clear, straight-grained heartwood sections suitable for carving. Each piece is examined, discussed, set aside for specific uses. Nothing is wasted. Smaller pieces become firewood or are left in the forest to rot and nourish the soil. The branches are piled to create habitat for small animals. The roots are excavated for future use. The entire process is choreographed by the principle that if you take a life, even a tree's life, you honor that sacrifice by using everything, wasting nothing. Consider this. In modern consumer culture, we've lost touch with the origin of nearly everything we use. Your wooden furniture came from where? Cut by whom? Under what circumstances? The disconnection is nearly complete. Materials appear in stores as if by magic, with no history, no context, no relationship. The Haida cedar harvest forces ongoing awareness of where things come from, what sacrifices they represent, what relationships they embody. Every carved mask begins with a tree that lived for centuries. Every canoe represents the gift of a forest elder. You can't forget that. You can't take it for granted. What would change if you knew the origin story of everything you owned? If every object carried with it some awareness of what was given to create it? The cedar has been harvested, processed, and transported to the carving shed, a structure that's part workshop, part sacred space. But before any carving begins, there are more protocols to observe. Traditional Haida carvers maintained strict practices around their work. Some were practical, keeping tools sharp and organized, maintaining clean workspace, ensuring proper lighting. But others were explicitly spiritual, designed to honor the cedar's gift and ensure the carving process went well. A master carver would often fast before beginning an important piece, not eating for a day or more to purify himself and sharpen his spiritual sensitivity. He might bathe in cold water, might spend time in prayer or meditation, might consult with elders about the proper designs to use. The tools themselves were sacred objects. Traditional carving tools, adzes, knives, wedges, were crafted with great care, often by the carver himself or inherited from teachers and ancestors. A good adze, properly maintained, could last several lifetimes. Its handle would be shaped to fit its owner's hands perfectly. Its blade would be sharpened and resharpened until eventually the metal wore away and had to be replaced. These tools were never casually left lying around or used for mundane tasks. They were stored carefully, often wrapped in cedar bark, sometimes kept in special carved boxes. Some carvers sang to their tools, maintained relationships with them as partners in the work of transformation. This might seem excessive until you realize what these tools represented. They were the means by which cedar was transformed from tree to art, from material to spiritual vessel. They were instruments of sacred work, and treating them as sacred reinforced the importance of the work itself. The space where carving happened was also carefully maintained. Traditionally, important carving might be done in a designated area of a longhouse or in a special carving shed constructed for the purpose. The space would be cleaned, sometimes smudged with sacred smoke, cedar bark or other traditional medicines burned to purify the air and invite helpful spirits. The carver might create a small altar or offering space. Nothing elaborate, perhaps just a shelf where tobacco or other traditional offerings were kept, where one could pause during the work to remember why the work mattered. And the work would often be done in company. Not a crowd, the carver needed space and concentration, but perhaps one or two trusted people, often apprentices learning by watching, sometimes elders who could advise on design elements or tell stories that connected the work to deeper traditions. The stories told during carving weren't idle entertainment. They were mnemonics, teaching tools, ways of embedding knowledge in narrative form. An elder might tell the story of how ravens stole the sun while the carver worked on a raven design, and embedded in that familiar tale would be subtle information about how raven's beak should curve, where his eyes should sit, how his wings should fold. This is oral tradition functioning at its highest level, not just preserving stories, but using stories as vessels for technical knowledge, spiritual understanding, and cultural continuity. A young carver listening to these stories year after year would gradually absorb not just the plots, but the deeper information encoded within them. The atmosphere during carving was contemplative but not silent. There might be quiet conversation, the sharing of food, occasional laughter, but there was also an underlying seriousness, an awareness that what was being created mattered. A mask being carved for an important ceremony carried supernatural power. A totem pole being carved to commemorate ancestors represented generations of family history. Mistakes weren't just aesthetic failures, they could bring spiritual consequences. One of the most important protocols involved maintaining the right relationship with the cedar throughout the carving process. The wood wasn't inert material. It still carried the spirit of the tree, still deserved respect. Carvers would speak to the wood, apologize when removing too much in error, thank the wood when a difficult section came out perfectly. This constant dialogue, whether spoken aloud or maintained internally, kept the carver humble, kept him aware that he was facilitating a transformation, not commanding it. The form emerged from the wood through partnership between human intention and cedar's inherent properties. Contemporary Haida carvers who maintain traditional protocols describe entering a state during deep carving work that's almost trance-like. Hours pass unnoticed. The distinction between carver and carved blurs. The wood seems to guide the tools as much as the hands guide them. This isn't mystical language. It's an accurate description of what happens when skill becomes so embodied that conscious thought recedes and something deeper takes over. But perhaps the most important protocol was this: the understanding that cedar harvest and carving were ongoing relationships, not one-time transactions. A carver who took cedar from a particular grove carried responsibility for that grove forever after. He would return periodically, not just to harvest more, but to check on the forest's health, to remove damaged trees that might threaten healthy ones, to encourage certain growth patterns. This is what sustainable relationship looks like. Not take what you need and leave, but take what you need and maintain the relationship that made the gift possible. The carver understood that his grandchildren would need cedar too, and the way he harvested today would determine what forest his grandchildren inherited. The Haida had practices to ensure cedar regeneration. They knew that old-growth cedar eventually falls, and that cleared spaces allow young trees to grow. They knew which areas had been harvested by their grandparents and were now producing prime timber again. They knew how to encourage straight growth by clearing competing vegetation around young cedars. This wasn't wilderness preservation in the modern sense, leaving nature completely alone. And it wasn't industrial forestry, maximizing short-term extraction. It was something else: sustained yield management based on multi-generational thinking, on the understanding that the forest was not a resource bank to be depleted, but a living community to be tended. The protocols surrounding cedar harvest and carving weren't burdensome restrictions. They were technologies for maintaining right relationship across generations. Every ceremony, every prayer, every act of respect was reinforcing a worldview that made sustainable practice not just possible, but inevitable. You couldn't rush the harvest because the ceremonies took time. You couldn't waste material because you'd asked the tree for permission to take it. You couldn't exploit carelessly because you'd return to this grove next year, and the year after, and your grandchildren would return after you were gone. The modern world has mostly abandoned protocol in favor of efficiency. But efficiency toward what end? We can clear-cut a mountain in days, but we've destroyed forests that took 10,000 years to develop. We've gained speed but lost sustainability. We've maximized short-term yield but bankrupted the future. The Haida protocols weren't primitive superstitions to be outgrown. They were sophisticated technologies for maintaining long-term relationships with living systems. And we desperately need to remember them. Now we come to the heart of the tradition, the actual work of transforming cedar from log to art, from material to meaning. This is where generations of accumulated knowledge, where individual genius, where spiritual understanding all converge in the movement of blade through wood. Let's start with the tools, because tools are not neutral. They shape what's possible. They embody cultural knowledge. A Haida carver's toolkit is fundamentally different from a European woodworker's toolkit, and those differences reveal deep philosophical distinctions. The primary tool of the Haida carver is the adze, a blade mounted perpendicular to its handle, swung like an axe but cutting like a chisel. To European eyes first encountering Northwest coast art, the adze seemed primitive, less sophisticated than the saws and planes of European carpentry. But this revealed the Europeans' blindness, not the tool's limitations. The adze is perfect for working with cedar. It removes wood efficiently, following the grain naturally, allowing the carver to shape large surfaces quickly while maintaining sensitivity to the wood's character. A master carver with an adze can remove material almost as precisely as a sculptor with chisels, but with far greater speed, and with a relationship to the wood that cutting tools can't match. Different adzes serve different purposes. A large D-adze with a blade 6 inches wide is used for roughing out major forms, hollowing canoes, shaping the basic contours of a totem pole. A smaller elbow adze with a curved handle and narrower blade allows more detailed work, getting into corners and curves. A straight adze works for flat surfaces. Each tool has its specific application, learned through years of practice. The handles are as important as the blades. A carver typically makes his own handles, shaping them to fit his hand perfectly, adjusting the angle to match his swing mechanics. The handle might be carved from yew wood, hard, dense, beautiful to look at and hold. It might be decorated with carved designs that identify it as belonging to a particular carver or family lineage. The blade itself, traditionally made of jade or other hard stone, later of iron and steel, must be kept sharp enough to shave with. A dull adze is worse than useless. It's dangerous, more likely to slip and catch, more likely to tear the wood rather than cut it cleanly. Sharpening is constant, a meditative practice done before carving, during breaks, after work. Some carvers sharpen their blades every few minutes during active work. They keep multiple stones, coarse for rough sharpening, progressively finer for polishing the edge. The sound of blade on stone becomes a rhythm underlying the entire carving process, a reminder of the care required to do the work well. Beyond adzes, carvers use knives, not European-style knives with handles and single-edged blades, but crooked knives with curved blades that allow pulling cuts, giving enormous control for detail work. These knives can carve lines finer than pencil marks, can create the delicate details of eyes and feathers and scales that bring a carved face to life. Wedges and mauls, wooden hammers and splitting wedges made from hardwood or antler are used for splitting logs and for removing large sections of wastewood. The sound of mallet on wedge is one of the fundamental rhythms of the carving shed, a percussion that marks the progress of work. Then there are specialized tools: bent corner knives for reaching into tight spaces, small adzes barely bigger than chisels for fine detail, scorps, curved draw knives, for hollowing, various scrapers for smoothing surfaces. A master carver might have dozens of tools, each one specific to particular tasks, each one maintained with obsessive care. But here's what's crucial to understand. These tools are extensions of the carver's body and mind. A master carver doesn't think, "I need to remove wood here, so I'll use this tool in this way." The thought and the action are simultaneous. The hand moves before the conscious mind registers the decision. This is embodied knowledge, learned over decades, embedded so deeply in muscle and nerve that it becomes instinctual. Watching a master carver work is like watching a dancer or a martial artist. There's a quality of flow, of effortless efficiency that reveals decades of practice. The adze swings in a rhythm that seems almost musical. Wood chips fly in a steady stream. The form emerges not laboriously but organically, as if the carver is simply revealing what was always hidden in the wood. But this appearance of ease masks extraordinary effort and skill. Every swing of the adze must be controlled perfectly. Too much force and you remove too much wood or damage the grain. Too little and you waste energy and time. Every cut must follow the grain at the correct angle, must remove exactly the right amount of material, must leave the surface ready for the next cut. The carver must maintain multiple scales of awareness simultaneously. He's thinking about the overall form, the proportions, the balance, the way the piece will look from different angles. He's thinking about the immediate work, this particular cut, this specific section. And he's thinking about the wood itself, how the grain is running, where knots might be hidden, how the wood is responding to the tools. Physical stamina is essential. Carving a major piece, a totem pole, a large canoe, requires weeks or months of daily work. The carver's arms, shoulders, back, and core must be strong enough to swing tools hour after hour. But it's not brute strength. It's controlled power, efficiency of movement, knowing how to let the tool's weight do the work rather than forcing it. Traditional carvers developed distinctive bodies, heavily muscled in the arms and shoulders, often with one side more developed than the other from the asymmetry of adze work. Their hands were scarred from occasional slips, calloused from tool handles, but surprisingly sensitive, able to feel the subtlest variations in wood texture, able to detect a dull blade edge by touch alone. And their eyes, experienced carvers could see things in wood that others couldn't. They could look at a rough log and visualize the finished form. They could spot imperfections invisible to untrained eyes. They could judge depth and proportion with extraordinary accuracy, working without measurements or guides, trusting their visual sense developed over decades. But perhaps most importantly, master carvers developed a quality that's hard to name. Call it artistic sensitivity, spiritual awareness, aesthetic judgment. They knew not just how to carve well technically, but how to carve meaningfully. They understood that a mask wasn't just a face carved in wood. It was a vessel for supernatural power, and it had to be carved in a way that honored that power and allowed it to manifest during ceremony. This is where technique transcends into art, where craft becomes spirituality. And this is why becoming a master carver took not just years but decades. Not just because the technical skills were difficult to acquire, but because the depth of understanding required couldn't be rushed. Before the first cut is made, the master carver spends time with the wood, looking, touching, sometimes just sitting with it, learning what it wants to become. This isn't mysticism dressed up as practical work. This is practical work so refined that it appears mystical. Cedar grain runs in predictable patterns, but every log is unique. There are variations in color. Some cedar is almost white, some is deep reddish-brown, and every shade between. There are variations in density. Some sections are soft enough to carve with moderate effort, others are hard enough to dull tools quickly. There are knots, grain swirls, pitch pockets, and countless other irregularities that must be accounted for. A mediocre carver looks at a log and sees problems, obstacles to be worked around or removed. A master carver looks at the same log and sees opportunities. That knot might become an eye. That dark streak of grain might suggest a design element. That slight curve in the log might be the beginning of a particular form. The carver walks around the log, observing it from every angle. He marks potential forms with charcoal, rough outlines, proportional guidelines, placement of major features. But these marks are suggestions, not rigid plans. He remains open to what the wood reveals as he begins cutting. For a totem pole, the carver must envision the entire composition, the stacking of figures, the proportions of each element, the flow from bottom to top. Traditional poles often tell stories, with figures representing family crests, supernatural encounters, or historical events arranged in specific order. The challenge is translating this narrative into three-dimensional form while accounting for the log's dimensions and characteristics. The carver typically starts at the top of the pole, working downward. This might seem counterintuitive, but it's practical. As work progresses and scaffolding is removed, you want the finished sections above you, not below where they might be damaged. The top figure, often an eagle, raven, or other bird, is carved first, establishing the proportions and style that will govern the entire pole. Rough shaping comes first, using large adzes to remove massive amounts of waste wood, establishing the basic forms and proportions. The log transforms from cylinder to something more complex, bulges where faces will be, depressions where negative spaces need to exist, the overall sculptural quality emerging. This phase of work is physically demanding and requires confident, decisive action. The carver can't hesitate. He must commit to each cut, trusting his judgment about how much to remove and where. Mistakes at this stage are difficult to correct. Remove too much wood and you might lose an entire design element, might make the pole structurally weak, might have to reconceive the entire composition. But watch how the master carver works, and you'll see that mistakes rarely happen. His cuts are sure, his judgment reliable. He's not working from detailed plans or measurements. He's working from an internalized sense of form and proportion developed over decades. He can look at a section and know instinctively how much wood needs to be removed. He can judge curves and angles without measuring tools. His eye and hand work together seamlessly. As rough shaping progresses, the wood itself begins to guide the work. The carver discovers things. A beautiful grain pattern that suggests modifying a design, a hidden knot that requires adjustment, a section of wood that cuts particularly well and invites more detailed work. He remains flexible, dialoguing with the material, finding the balance between his vision and the wood's properties. Traditional Haida designs follow specific conventions: formline design, a system of flowing curved lines that define forms and create visual harmony. Eyes are typically oval with defined eyelids. Mouths are curved, often showing teeth or tongue. Bodies are suggested rather than realistically depicted. Colors, traditionally black and red, sometimes blue-green, are used to enhance and define the carved forms. But within these conventions is enormous room for individual expression. Two carvers given the same assignment, carve a raven, for instance, will produce completely different results. One might emphasize the beak, making it bold and aggressive. Another might emphasize the eyes, creating a more mystical feeling. The conventions provide structure, but artistry happens within and sometimes playfully against those conventions. As the rough form emerges, the carver begins more detailed work: smaller adzes, knives, detailed cutting. Faces become more defined, eye sockets hollowed, eyeballs suggested in relief, pupils carved or painted. Mouths open to show tongues and teeth, carved with stunning three-dimensional depth. Feathers are suggested through flowing carved lines. Claws, fins, ears, whatever features the being requires, are carved with attention to both anatomical accuracy and stylistic convention. The surface quality changes during this phase. The roughness of initial shaping gives way to smoother, more refined surfaces. The carver might use progressively finer tools, might scrape surfaces with specialized scrapers, might even sand certain areas, though traditional carvers often preferred the slightly textured surface left by sharp tools rather than the dead smoothness of sandpaper. Throughout this work, the carver maintains awareness of the whole composition. A totem pole must work visually from every angle. It must be balanced, not necessarily symmetrical, but balanced in a more complex way that accounts for visual weight, color, density of detail. It must tell its story clearly while also functioning as pure sculptural form. There's a quality in the finest traditional Haida carving that's hard to articulate. A sense of life, of presence, of power contained in wood. The figures don't just represent supernatural beings, they seem to actually contain them. Masks don't just look like faces, they feel like faces, with personality, with emotion, with something behind the eyes. This quality comes partly from technical mastery, from knowing how to carve eyes that seem to see, mouths that seem about to speak. But it comes also from something less tangible, from the carver's spiritual understanding, from his belief that he's not creating but revealing, not imposing but facilitating. The spirit was always there in the cedar. The carver just removes everything that isn't the spirit until only the essential form remains. The master carver's ability to read wood and see potential forms reveals something profound about attention and relationship. In our hurried modern lives, we rarely give anything this level of sustained attention. We look at things superficially, categorically, instrumentally. What can this do for me? How can I use it? What's its value? The carver's attention is different. It's patient, receptive, honoring. He's not imposing his will on the wood. He's discovering what's possible through careful observation and sensitive response. This is a model for how we might relate to everything, to other people, to nature, to our own creative work. What would you discover if you gave something this level of attention? If you spent hours just looking, touching, sensing, allowing understanding to emerge rather than forcing conclusions? Let's watch now as the carving nears completion. The basic forms are established, the details are emerging, and the piece is beginning to reveal its full character. This is the phase that requires the most refined judgment, where years of experience become most crucial. The carver is working on a ceremonial mask, a transformation mask that will be used in winter ceremonies. This particular mask represents Thunderbird, one of the most powerful supernatural beings in Haida cosmology. The mask must be carved with extraordinary care because it will be worn during sacred dances, will be the vehicle through which a human dancer becomes Thunderbird, will channel supernatural power. The basic face is complete. The large eyes with their bold eyelids, the massive beak curved and powerful, the fierce expression that captures Thunderbird's nature. Now comes the detail work that will bring the mask fully alive. The carver uses a small crooked knife to carve the fine lines around the eyes, form lines that define and enhance the eye shape, that create the distinctive Northwest Coast aesthetic. His hand is steady, the knife moving with perfect control. A single slip could ruin days of work, but he doesn't slip. The line flows smoothly, curves with precision, ends exactly where it should. He carves the feathers suggested on the mask's surface. Not realistic feathers, but stylized representations following formline convention. Each feather is defined by flowing lines that echo the overall design, creating visual harmony. The negative spaces between feathers are as important as the feathers themselves. They create contrast, allow the eye to rest, give the design its rhythm. The inside of the mask must be hollowed carefully, enough to make it lightweight and wearable, not so much that it becomes fragile. The carver uses curved adzes and specialized hollowing tools, removing wood in thin layers, constantly checking thickness by holding the mask up to light, feeling through the wood with his fingers. Around the edge of the mask, he carves the attachment points for the cedar bark or leather ties that will secure it to a dancer's face. These must be strong enough to hold but invisible from the front. The placement must be exact, so the mask sits properly on the dancer's face, allowing vision through the eye holes, allowing the dancer to breathe. This is where the relationship between carver and dancer becomes crucial. Traditional masks were often carved specifically for particular dancers, accounting for their face shape, their height, their style of movement. A good mask fits its dancer perfectly, becomes an extension of their body during performance, allows them to fully embody the supernatural being they're representing. The carver might consult with the dancer during the carving process, have them try the mask on, adjust the fit, modify the eye holes or the weight distribution. This collaborative relationship ensures that the finished mask works practically while maintaining its spiritual power and aesthetic excellence. Now comes painting, an essential final step that completes the transformation. Traditional Haida art uses a limited palette, black, red, and sometimes blue-green, but these colors are applied with sophisticated understanding of how color enhances form. The paints themselves are traditionally made from natural materials, black from charcoal mixed with salmon egg oil or animal fat as a binder, red from ochre, a naturally occurring iron oxide, blue-green from copper oxide. These paints have a matte, slightly textured quality quite different from modern synthetic paints. They soak into the wood rather than sitting on top of it, becoming part of the material rather than a coating. The carver, or sometimes a specialist painter working with the carver, applies paint with brushes made from animal hair, often porcupine guard hairs trimmed to create flexible, responsive brushes. The painting follows the carved forms, enhancing them, clarifying them, creating areas of contrast and visual interest. Black typically defines the form lines, the primary flowing lines that structure the design. Red fills certain areas, creating visual weight and warmth. The natural cedar color is left visible in other areas, creating a three-color composition of black, red, and natural wood tone. The interplay of these colors with the carved forms creates extraordinary visual richness. But painting isn't just aesthetic, it's also protective. The oil-based paints seal the wood, protecting it from moisture and weathering. A well-painted mask or pole can last for decades, even in the wet climate of the Pacific Northwest. As the final paint strokes are applied, something remarkable happens. The mask, which has been slowly coming alive throughout the carving process, suddenly becomes fully present. The colors activate the forms. The face takes on personality. The spirit of Thunderbird is now visible, contained in cedar, ready to manifest during ceremony. The carver steps back, studies the finished mask from various angles, checks every detail. He looks for any final adjustments needed, any spots that require touching up. But mostly, he's checking something less tangible. Does the mask work? Does it have power? Does it properly represent Thunderbird in a way that will be effective during ceremony? This judgment can't be taught directly. It comes from deep cultural knowledge, from understanding what makes a mask spiritually effective, from having seen hundreds of masks in use over a lifetime, from having participated in ceremonies and witnessed what happens when a well-carved mask is danced properly. Finally satisfied, the carver might perform a small private ceremony, thanking the cedar once more, thanking the tools, thanking the teachers who taught him, thanking the spirits who guided the work. This isn't required, but many carvers feel compelled to mark the completion of an important piece with some form of acknowledgement. The finished mask is carefully wrapped and stored until needed for ceremony. During the winter ceremonial season, it will be unwrapped, prepared, and danced. A dancer will put it on, and in that moment of transformation, wearing Thunderbird's face, something remarkable occurs. The line between human and supernatural blurs. The dancer isn't pretending to be Thunderbird. Through the power of the mask, through the skill of the dance, through the collective belief of the community witnessing, the dancer becomes Thunderbird, manifesting the supernatural being's power and presence. This is what the carved mask is for. Not decoration, not art in the modern sense of something to be passively observed, but active spiritual technology, a tool for transformation and manifestation. The carver's work makes this transformation possible. Without the skill, the knowledge, the spiritual understanding embedded in the carving, the transformation wouldn't work. The completed mask represents thousands of hours of learning. The carver's apprenticeship, his years of practice, his ongoing deepening of skill and understanding. It represents the knowledge of countless previous generations, their discoveries and refinements, their understanding of materials and forms and meanings. It represents the cedar's gift, the tree's sacrifice, the forest's generosity, and it represents the continuity of tradition, the unbroken chain connecting present to past, connecting living carvers to ancestors, connecting the community to its stories and its spirits. As long as masks continue to be carved, as long as cedar continues to be transformed through skill and prayer and patience, the tradition lives. The carving process reveals something essential about mastery and presence. The master carver isn't thinking about the past or worrying about the future. He's completely absorbed in the present moment, in this cut, this line, this specific challenge. Yet paradoxically, he's also connected to deep time, to traditions stretching back millennia, to ancestors watching over his shoulder, to future generations who will see this work. This combination of present moment focus and multi-generational awareness is increasingly rare in modern life. We're either distracted by constant stimulation or anxious about past and future. We've lost the ability to be fully present while simultaneously aware of our place in a larger story. The Carver's state of mind, utterly focused yet deeply connected, working alone yet surrounded by ancestors and spirits, creating something new yet honoring ancient patterns. This is a model for how we might live more fully, more meaningfully, more in balance with both immediate experience and larger context. Now we must turn to a darker part of this story, the period when Haida carving nearly died completely, when it seemed that thousands of years of accumulated knowledge would vanish within a single generation. By the early 1900s, the Haida population had crashed from disease and cultural disruption. Fewer than 2,000 people survived, concentrated in just 2 villages. The potlatch, the ceremony where carved works were displayed and carving knowledge was transmitted, had been banned by the Canadian government in 1884. Children were being forcibly removed to residential schools where they were punished for speaking their language or practicing their culture. The great master carvers of the 19th century were dying, and few young people were learning the tradition. Why would they? The dominant culture treated their art as primitive curiosities, their language as barbaric, their entire way of life as something to be erased and replaced with European civilization. Missionaries and government agents actively worked to eliminate traditional practices. Old totem poles were allowed to rot or were collected by museums and taken away. Carved masks and regalia were confiscated or destroyed. The tools of cultural continuity were being systematically dismantled. Some carvers continued working in private, maintaining the tradition quietly despite official hostility. But without public ceremonies, without the social context that gave carved works their meaning, without new apprentices learning the old ways, the tradition was dying. By the 1950s and 60s, only a handful of master carvers remained, mostly elderly men who had learned from the previous generation. Their knowledge was vast, but without students to receive it, that knowledge would die with them. The chain of transmission, unbroken for thousands of years, was about to snap. But then something remarkable happened. Beginning in the 1960s and accelerating through the 70s and 80s, a cultural renaissance began. Young Haida people, tired of cultural shame and erasure, began reclaiming their heritage. The potlatch ban had been repealed in 1951. Residential schools were finally closing. Space opened for cultural revival. A few key individuals became pivotal in this revival. Bill Reed, part Haida through his mother's line, raised mostly outside the culture, became obsessed with traditional Haida art as a young adult. He sought out the remaining master carvers, learned what he could, and began creating new works in traditional styles. His work brought Haida art to mainstream attention, proved that the tradition could continue, inspired others. Robert Davidson from Old Masset learned from his grandfather and from Reed. In 1969, at age 23, he carved and raised the first new totem pole in Old Masset in nearly a century. The ceremony drew hundreds of people. It was a declaration: we're still here. Our culture is alive. Our traditions continue. Other carvers emerged: Jim Hart, Chief James of the Wolves, Christian White, Reg Davidson, and many others. They faced enormous challenges. Much knowledge had been lost. Certain techniques had to be reinvented through trial and error. The social context for carved works had changed. Many pieces now were created for museums or private collectors rather than for traditional ceremony. But they persisted. They sought out remaining elders, recorded their knowledge, learned what they could from old photographs and museum collections. They experimented, innovated, adapted, always trying to remain true to fundamental principles while acknowledging that the tradition had to evolve to survive. Importantly, they also began formal teaching programs. The Gitanmac School of Northwest Coast Indian Art, founded in 1969, trained a new generation of carvers. Community workshops, apprenticeship programs, cultural centers, infrastructure developed to support knowledge transmission in new ways appropriate to changed circumstances. The revival wasn't just about carving. It was part of a broader cultural resurgence. Language programs were established to preserve and revitalize Haida language. Cultural protocols around cedar harvest and land stewardship were reasserted. Traditional governance structures were strengthened. The carving revival was embedded in this larger movement of cultural renewal, and it worked. Today, Haida carving is not just surviving but thriving. There are more active carvers now than there were in the 1960s. Major polls are being raised regularly. Museums are repatriating stolen cultural objects. Young people are learning traditional skills and techniques. The tradition lives, transformed, yes. Adapted to new circumstances, yes, but fundamentally continuous with its deep past. The chain didn't break. Knowledge that nearly died is flourishing again. Let's visit a contemporary carving shed to see how the tradition continues today. The physical space looks different from traditional settings. Electric lights supplement natural light. Power tools sit alongside traditional hand tools. Photographs and design sketches cover the walls. But the essential atmosphere is the same. Focus, respect, attention to craft. A master carver, let's call him James, is working on a commissioned totem pole for a community center. He's in his 50s, has been carving since childhood when he learned from his uncle. He uses both traditional and modern tools, choosing based on what each task requires. For rough shaping, he might use a chainsaw. It's faster and less physically taxing than traditional methods. But he uses it carefully, respectfully, never removing more wood than necessary. For detailed work, he uses traditional adzes and knives exclusively. Power tools can't feel the wood like hand tools can, he explains. You lose something essential if you rely too much on machines. James maintains traditional protocols, despite living in a modern context. Before beginning this pole, he and several community members went into the forest to harvest the cedar. They followed old practices, requesting permission, making offerings, thanking the tree. Some people think that's just symbolic now, James says. But it's not. It matters. It reminds you what you're doing, why it matters. It keeps you humble. The cedar was transported to the carving shed using a truck, practical necessity in the modern world. But once the work began, James approached it with traditional mindset. He studied the wood for days before making the first cut. He consulted with community elders about the stories that would be told on the pole. He fasted before beginning the actual carving, following old protocols. Modern Haida carvers face challenges their ancestors didn't. They work in a cash economy. They must sell their work to survive, which changes the relationship between carver and carved object. They work for diverse audiences. Some pieces go to traditional ceremonial use, others to museums, others to private collectors with no Haida connection. They must navigate questions of cultural appropriation and intellectual property. What happens when non-native people want to buy Haida designs? What about non-native people who want to learn carving? These are complex questions without simple answers, requiring each generation to find its own balance between cultural preservation and appropriate sharing. They must also balance innovation with tradition. Some contemporary carvers experiment with new forms, new materials, new contexts for traditional designs. Others feel that innovation risks losing essential elements of the tradition. These debates are healthy. They show that the tradition is alive, wrestling with how to remain authentic while adapting to changed circumstances. But watch James' work, and you see fundamental continuities with ancient practice. His hands move with the same economical efficiency that master carvers have always demonstrated. He reads the wood with the same attentive sensitivity. He understands that he's not just making art, he's maintaining a relationship with cedar that stretches back thousands of years. He teaches younger carvers, continuing the apprenticeship tradition. 3 young people, 2 Haida, 1 from a neighboring First Nation, work in the shed regularly, learning by watching, by helping, by gradually taking on more complex tasks under James's guidance. This is how knowledge is transmitted, how traditions continue. I tell the young ones, James says, that they're not just learning to carve, they're learning to see, learning to pay attention, learning to respect materials and processes and the knowledge that previous generations accumulated. If they learn that, the technical skills will come. One of the young apprentices, a woman in her early 20s named Sarah, describes her journey into carving. My grandfather was a carver, but he died before I was born. Growing up, I didn't have much connection to the culture. My mom had been to residential school and didn't talk about traditions much. But when I was in high school, I saw a demonstration at a cultural center, and something just clicked. I knew I needed to learn this. Sarah has been apprenticing with James for 3 years. The hardest part isn't the physical work, she says. It's the patience. You can't rush. You have to let the wood teach you. James says that all the time. Listen to the wood. I didn't understand what he meant at first. Now I'm starting to get it. She's currently working on her first mask, a relatively simple design but executed with care and growing confidence. James checks her work regularly, offering suggestions, occasionally demonstrating a technique, but mostly letting her learn through doing. She's got good hands, he says. And more importantly, she's got the right attitude. She's not trying to become famous or make money. She wants to understand the tradition, to be part of something larger than herself. That's what makes a real carver. The revival of Haida carving has gone hand in hand with renewed commitment to cedar forest stewardship. The Haida Nation has fought decades-long legal and political battles to protect old-growth cedar forests on Haida Gwaii from industrial logging. In the 1980s and 90s, logging companies were clear-cutting massive areas of ancient forest. The Haida responded with blockades, with legal challenges, with persistent political organizing. In 1985, Haida protesters blocked logging trucks at Athli Gwaii, Lyell Island, leading to arrests but also to national attention. The protest worked. The area became protected as Gwaii Hana's National Park Reserve. These victories weren't just about preserving scenery or biodiversity, though those matter. They were about preserving the relationship between Haida people and cedar, protecting the source of their material culture, ensuring that future generations would have access to the trees that make their traditions possible. Today, the Council of the Haida Nation works with Parks Canada and the BC government to co-manage protected areas on Haida Gwaii. Traditional knowledge informs management decisions. Cedar harvest for cultural purposes is permitted and encouraged within protected areas, following traditional protocols that ensure sustainability. Some Haida communities have established their own cedar stewardship programs. Young people are taught traditional ecological knowledge alongside modern forestry science. They learn to identify culturally modified trees, to understand cedar life cycle and regeneration, to harvest sustainably. These programs recognize that cultural survival and ecological health are inseparable. You can't maintain carving traditions without healthy cedar forests. You can't maintain healthy cedar forests without people who understand cedar as more than timber, who relate to trees as relatives rather than resources. Contemporary Haida forestry looks different from both industrial logging and from hands-off wilderness preservation. It's active management based on multi-generational thinking, on understanding forests as complex living systems that benefit from appropriate human interaction. Traditional cedar harvest practices, removing bark from living trees, selectively harvesting individual trees while maintaining forest structure, actually promote cedar regeneration in ways that benefit both trees and humans. Modern research is confirming what Haida people always knew. Careful harvest can be compatible with long-term forest health. This knowledge is being shared beyond Haida communities. Conservation organizations, forestry schools, and government agencies are increasingly interested in Indigenous forest management practices. There's growing recognition that Indigenous peoples aren't obstacles to conservation. They're experienced partners with knowledge systems that Western science is only beginning to appreciate. The story of Haida cedar stewardship offers hope in our era of ecological crisis. It demonstrates that sustainability isn't about leaving nature alone. It's about maintaining relationships of reciprocity and respect. It shows that traditional knowledge isn't quaint folklore, but sophisticated ecological science developed over millennia. It proves that cultural survival and ecological health support each other. For Haida carvers, the living forest remains fundamental. Every mask, every pole, every carved object is a reminder that their art depends on healthy ecosystems. The responsibility to care for cedar forests isn't separate from their artistic practice. It's integral to it. You can't be a carver without being a steward. The contemporary Haida relationship with cedar forests challenges us to rethink conservation itself. Western conservation has typically emphasized preservation, keeping humans out, protecting nature from people. But the Haida model suggests a different approach: humans as participants in ecosystems, active relationship as the basis for long-term health. What would change if we understood ourselves not as external to nature but as part of it? Not as managers imposing control, but as participants in ongoing relationships. Not as consumers of resources, but as receivers of gifts that require reciprocity. The Haida haven't achieved perfect sustainability. No human society has. But they've maintained a working relationship with cedar forests for thousands of years, taking what they need while ensuring regeneration continues. That's an achievement our industrial society, barely 2 centuries old and already facing ecological collapse, would do well to study humbly. We've journeyed together through the world of Haida master carvers, from the misty forests where cedar grows to the carving sheds where wood becomes art, from the near death of a tradition to its contemporary revival. Now, as we conclude, let's consider what this story means for all of us, regardless of our cultural background or connection to cedar forests. The Haida relationship with cedar teaches first and foremost about patience, the willingness to work on timescales longer than individual lives. A cedar grows for centuries before it's ready for harvest. A carver trains for decades before becoming a master. A tradition unfolds across thousands of years, refined by countless generations. This is the opposite of our culture of instant gratification, of quarterly profits, of viral sensations and rapid turnover. What would change in your life if you thought in terms of decades rather than days? If you committed to something knowing the fruits might not appear for years? If you measured success not by immediate results but by long-term impact? The tradition teaches about relationship, understanding that we're not separate from the natural world but embedded within it, obligated to it, dependent on its generosity. The Haida don't just use cedar. They maintain relationship with cedar across generations. This relationship includes protocols of respect, practices of reciprocity, and ongoing responsibility for forest health. In our disconnected modern lives, where materials appear in stores with no visible origin story, we've lost this sense of relationship. We consume without knowing what we're consuming, without understanding the ecological and human costs of our consumption. The Haida model invites us to reconnect, to know where things come from, to honor what's given, to consider the full cycle of take and return. What relationships in your life would deepen if you approached them with the same intentionality that Haida carvers bring to cedar? What would you discover about the origins of what you consume if you traced those origins back to their sources? The tradition teaches about continuity, how knowledge survives catastrophe, how traditions adapt without losing their essence, how threads of connection can remain unbroken even when everything seems lost. The Haida carving tradition survived near total cultural genocide. It survived because people believed it was worth preserving at enormous personal cost. What knowledge in your own life is worth that level of commitment? What traditions, what practices, what ways of being do you want to ensure survive into future generations? And what are you willing to sacrifice to make that survival possible? The tradition also teaches humility, the recognition that we're part of something larger than ourselves, that our individual lives are brief moments in much longer stories, that the greatest honor comes not from personal achievement, but from faithful transmission of what we've received. Master carvers don't seek fame, they seek to honor their teachers, to maintain the tradition, to pass knowledge to the next generation. Finally, the Haida cedar tradition teaches about presence, the capacity to be fully absorbed in the present moment while simultaneously aware of deep time. The carver at work is completely focused on this cut, this line, this immediate challenge. Yet he's also connected to ancestors, to future generations, to traditions spanning millennia. He's utterly alone with the wood, yet surrounded by invisible witnesses and helpers. This balance, between present and past, between individual and community, between innovation and tradition, is what we desperately need in our fragmented, distracted age. We need to learn to be fully present while remaining connected to larger contexts. We need to honor what we've received while remaining open to what wants to emerge. We need to work with the patience of cedar growth and the precision of the master carver's adze. The story of Haida master carvers is ultimately about what it means to be fully human, to be in right relationship with the living world, to maintain traditions while allowing them to evolve, to create beauty that serves both aesthetic and spiritual purposes, to understand ourselves as participants in stories larger and longer than our individual lives. As you return to your own life after this journey, carry with you the image of the master carver before the cedar log. Patient, respectful, attentive, skilled, humble. Carry the sound of adze on wood, the smell of fresh-cut cedar, the sight of form emerging from rough material through disciplined attention over time. And remember, the cedar is still growing in the misty forests of Haida. The carvers are still working, still teaching, still maintaining the ancient relationship. The tradition lives. And as long as it lives, it offers us all a model for how humans might live more beautifully, more sustainably, more meaningfully on this earth. May you find in your own life some practice worth the patience of centuries. May you discover relationships deserving of protocols and respect. May you learn to see the sacred in the ordinary, the profound in the practical, the eternal in the ephemeral. The cedar has taught the Haida for thousands of years. The cedar can teach us still, if we approach with humility, if we listen carefully, if we're willing to learn what patience and relationship and continuity truly mean. This is the gift. This is the teaching. This is what survives when everything else falls away. The knowledge that some things are worth preserving at any cost, that some relationships transcend individual lifetimes, that some traditions carry wisdom our fast-paced world desperately needs to remember. The cedar stands, the carvers work, the tradition continues, and we are all invited to witness, to learn, to carry forward what we've received. Thank you for taking this journey with us into the world of Haida master carvers and the sacred cedar. If this story moved you, consider what traditions in your own life deserve careful tending. Consider what relationships you might approach with the same reverence that Haida carvers bring to cedar. Until next time, walk gently with the knowledge that everything we use was once alive, that every gift deserves gratitude, that every tradition worth preserving requires someone willing to preserve it.